Hi everyone, I'm Shantanu Prakash and I'm the founder and managing director at EduComp. EduComp is a large education company. We have a presence in several areas in education, ranging from educational content to schools, higher education, skill development, test prep, as well as a few international ventures. Over the course of our journey over the past 7, 8 years in particular, we've invested in more than 10 education companies, both ed tech as well as non-ed tech. We've had successful exits in 4 of them and very proud of our investment in VisIQ and partnering visionary entrepreneurs who have the passion like Herman here. So really happy to be here, Herman. Thank you.
All right, so let's jump into the first one. So, India is what I've observed is a catch-up market in many respects. We catch up on things that is happening elsewhere, right? That's a great thing. While there is a lot of new stuff happening in India, but playing catch-up is a valid strategy as far as investments go. So, what business models you guys think are going to catch up?
Go ahead. After you.
Arman, I don't necessarily agree that the Indian education market has been a catch-up market actually. If you really look at the data, there are several areas in which India is leading in the adoption of technology. There are some very obvious examples. If you look at the level of technology penetration in private schools in India, that is way higher than many countries of the developed world, that is Europe, US, and so on. So we are not playing catch-up there. Certainly, as Pankaj said, we are not playing catch-up on test prep. We are not playing catch-up on the tutoring market, for example. There are some unique characteristics of the Indian education market. And there has been local innovation, there has been local entrepreneurship that has met those needs. For example, our higher education market, for example, one of the largest privately held higher education markets in the world is in India. Over 75% of capacity of engineering education and professional education in India is in private hands. That is not true almost anywhere else in the world. And the scale at which things happen in India is greater. Yes, there are some areas of edtech, and I think it's primarily because Indian education entrepreneurs haven't really thought global. And I think probably because the Indian domestic market has been so large, that has somewhere mentally prevented us from thinking that we can build products for a global audience. For example, the entire revolution on online learning and MOOCs simply passed us by, and now we are trying to catch up with that market. But except for that one small segment of the market, I think we are doing pretty okay in terms of innovation in education technology in India.
Now, talking about this, 60% of the consumption is going to happen in India. It's happening. And over the last few years, the education technology investments have definitely increased, right? I've spoken to so many investors are now talking about who have never invested in education are at least talking about it, right? At the same time, while the investments are increasing, we haven't seen a whole lot of investments happening in this space compared to other space like e-commerce or, taxi business or whatever, right? So why do you think that's the case? If there's such a large consumption that's happening, what's stopping us from spotting opportunities that can bring scale? Because we as entrepreneurs would like to hear that.
Arman, you mentioned about why is not enough capital chasing potentially scaled up education models in India. I think we should modify that question a little bit. Why is not enough institutional capital chasing education in India? If you see the domestic capital investment in education, that is in excess of $10 billion a year. A few years back, BCG did a study for us on the size of the education market. The current numbers are there are about 5,000 new schools that get established every year in India. Okay? Average 10 crores to 15 crores a pop, easily. That's about 60, 70,000 crores of domestic investment that goes into education every year. That's a reality. Okay? Look at the higher education sector. Okay? Now, let's shift a little bit. Okay? Why is institutional money not going in, there is only one clear answer. Okay, that's regulation. Okay, unless we as a nation agree that there can be some return on capital in investment in formal education, that's not going to happen. The amount of money that's required for some of the ed tech stuff, it doesn't add up to much really. Even if you look at all the people seeking capital in education today, obviously not everyone is going to get funded, but even if you add that up, I would think it's probably won't even add up to $500 million. Take the example of your company. You're one of the success stories out of India, but the total amount of capital you have raised is not very high. Okay, so education technology, which is a good thing. Education technology in India is not as capital investment, and that's great. That's good for efficiency of capital. And the sectors that really need capital, there is a gate. There's regulation. So you can't get institutional capital inside. Hopefully someday that's actually going to change. But now if you look at the global scenario, the largest amount of investment globally has also gone into formal education. If you look at companies like Laureate or Pearson, if you analyze the investments that they've made and you bifurcate, then what are the sectors? Formal, vocational, textbook, ed tech. Ed tech is actually a very small part of that investment. So countries such as Brazil, for example, that have opened up their education economy, they're attracting very large amounts of capital, but most of that capital is actually going into formal education.
If you look at all the educational institutions as corporations, then you would also see that they spend a lot of money on acquiring their customers, $3 billion in India. Now that's a whole lot of money. If somebody can crack that model, and I know of some company that tried to unsuccessfully, but somebody can figure out that model, there's a lot of money on the table. So now, another reason I see, Shantanu, besides all the investments that you were talking about, that why institutional investors are not there, is maybe also because there haven't been many exits, right? And those exits are a function of scale, and we definitely haven't seen. You build a very scalable business, of course, but that's a reality. That's quite rare. So, what are those challenges? What are those hurdles that are not letting education technology businesses scale? What is it that we as entrepreneurs need to look at?
So I think that's a good point. Not enough exits in the Indian education space, and that's a deterrent for money to come in. I broadly agree with that proposition. But what was there to exit in the first place? Okay, let's ask that question. Okay, there aren't enough investee companies out there in education. There have been a bunch of, if you remember 2008, 2009, there was a whole burst of money that got into education. Okay, private capital, that institutional capital that got invested in education. But that was more on the potential that the Indian education market is going to actually deliver returns. So the gap between promise and potential was too huge. And I think overall as a sector, education sector hasn't really performed to the expectations of private investors, and that's across the board. But I think that was the phase one. That was the first time in between 2007 and 2009, that foreign money even came into education for almost the very first time. And people have sort of changed their strategy now. I think the second round of investment is going to be, I think, far more selective, and we will probably 3 to 5 years later see a large number of successful exits. One of the great things that's happened is, of course, the internet, and that is actually going to change the dimension of how we look at education investments in India, because you can really divide Indian education into two buckets. I would say pre-internet and post-internet, because you can't really think of ed tech investments if you think that you don't have an internet infrastructure. Then what ed tech are you going to do? Okay, so pre-internet, you really have traditional education, which you can neither exit because you can't enter it in the first place. So post the internet revolution, I think you will see a lot more action.
I'm Pankaj. I run a small tourism education company, learntourism.com. My question is to Mr. Shantanu Prakash. You are only one listed company in the listed space in India. I mean, if you talk about the listed space, overseas, there are many billion-dollar companies. And the corporate governance issue that your company also came across, or whatever the issues were, so there are challenges to be in the listed space, to be in India. There are big challenges. So how you address that issue?
So,
I mean, your question is that there are challenges for listed education companies? Well, I mean, there are challenges for every company. I mean, these are business challenges that you go through. I think, firstly, there are a large number of listed education companies in India. Just to correct your knowledge on that, I think there are over 20 listed education companies in India. And I think many of them are very niche. For example, over 6 or 7 test prep companies in India are listed. There are a few diversified companies. Edicomp is a diversified company that are listed in the Indian stock markets. And I think challenges of education companies are similar to challenges of other sectors in India. Take, for example, the real estate sector. Okay, there are several sectors in India that are currently facing a bunch of macro issues, and education is no different from that.